Nikikutazama nasikia moyo wangu kuna furaha, nikikuona pembeni yangu nasikia moyo wangu na furaha. Ukienda mbali nami nasikia nimeumia, hata ukiniacha saa moja ni kama mwaka mzima shidani. Ukiniacha pamoja ni kama mwaka mzima shidani. Usiniache nakutamani, ukiwa karibu yangu sikia moyo una furaha. Elekeze mama, hata waniseme mimi usiku mchana wakala, nikiwa na wewe sijali mimi maneno.
In my view, Africa's weakness is mainly due to three things: technological underdevelopment, organizational incompetence, and military impotence. It is aggravated by political instability, social corruption, and the whole crisis of moral ambivalence arising out of the bubbling of the cultural melting pot. Implicit in concepts like Pax Britannica was the assumption that Western powers have special privileges for being armed to the teeth, while at the same time proceeding to disarm the natives. It was readily assumed that Western powers were civilized enough to initiate world wars, but Africans had to be stopped from waging tribal conflicts.
In 1988, in Lusaka, Zambia, we were very fortunate to have a breakfast with a remarkable, distinctive, and unique African scholar and intellectual activist. Ali Mazrui is a Kenyan-born global academic, public intellectual, and a leading political scientist on Africa, Islamic Studies, and the North-South relations. He was proudly a product of Africa. We met Professor Mazrui at a time when the African National Congress was still in exile in Zambia, other African countries, and different continents. We were also elated and blessed to meet up with some of our African National Congress leaders in exile in Lusaka. But for me, it was quite an uncomfortable and embarrassing moment, because I broke all the rules of etiquette, good manners. I went to Professor Mazrui's hotel room unannounced to wake him up to join us for breakfast. It was rude on my part, but my excitement to be in the company of Professor Mazrui was irresistible. I wanted to hear his thoughts during breakfast in somewhat of a private meeting. I just could not miss a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He was quite flustered that I disturbed him with my unexpected early wake-up call. But once he was settled at the breakfast table with us with a nice cup of black coffee, he was excited and ready for our unplanned discussion. It does not take long for one to realize that Professor Mazrui characterises African optimism. He strongly negates African pessimism. One could sense his African optimism in his face and voice. African optimism means good and promising produced outcomes for Africa and its racially diverse and culturally rich people. Both his voice and face were beaming with confidence, hope, better and greater outcomes for Africa and its persevering people. He was hopeful that future generations of Africans will make a better and promising future for Africa. The depressing post-colonial political, social, economic reality in some African countries did not negate his hopefulness of a better future for Africa and its persevering people. Mazrui said, Africa must conquer itself if it is to avoid further colonization by others. Africa needs to establish a Pax Africana, an African peace promoted and maintained by Africans themselves. Distressingly, the current political, social and economic reality in Africa are many moons away from Mazrui's optimistic vision of Africa. Tragically, African optimism is being negated by the self-inflicting outcomes in Sudan's civil war between two opposing African armies, and the civil war in the Democratic Republic of Congo between the government and the M23 rebel group supported by Rwanda. Specifically, the outcomes in Sudan and the Democratic Republic of the Congo seems like the fulfillment of William Butler Yeats' poetic verse, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold." This opening line of Yeats' poem signifies a sense of societal, governmental breakdown and chaos. Professor Mazrui was critical of the African ruling elite who governed their countries through mismanagement, bringing self-inflicting misery on the larger populations. But African pessimism is not a Mazrui weakness to which he will surrender. He leaves such pessimism to Africa's numerous pre- and post-colonial skeptics and adversaries. His understanding and perspective that a people denied history is a people deprived of dignity, which counters engineered colonization in all its manifestations, including neo-colonialism. Mazrui's outlook was that Africans must decide their own economic and political destiny, its future, independently, without colonial political engineering. Mazrui's family heritage was one of cultural and racial diversity. It is within this context and his deep sense of historical, cultural, and racial diversity that he said the following: acceptance of race mixture was more developed in Arab culture than in Jewish culture. Mazrui further elaborates on his cultural and racial diversity when he said the following: culture is the celebration of diversity. Let us therefore not deny our origin, but instead celebrate ours as a cultural mosaic, not a Tower of Babel, but a power of Babel. Professor Mazrui's reference to Babel highlights the story of the Tower of Babel as told in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 to 9 in the biblical Old Testament. My breakfast got cold whilst attentively listening to Mazrui, but it was worth it. It was his ideas, thoughts, perspectives, insight, and foresight which inspired me. It was a breakfast where Mazrui's conversation with us was the real food for thought. I wished we had more time with him, because it was the first and the last time I would meet Professor Ali Mazrui. His vibrant, cheerful, spirited personality, visionary scholarship, love of Africa, Africans and humanity at large left a permanent impression on us, particularly for those of us who were at the breakfast table with him. I wish I had the intellectual background at the time to grasp more comprehensively Professor Mazrui's profound and deeper scholarly reflections shared with us, particularly on Africa. Mazrui was born in 1933 and died in 2014. Professor Ali Mazrui was given a Muslim burial on Sunday, 19th October 2014 at his ancestral home in Fort Jesus, Mombasa, Kenya. When he returned to Allah, also revered as God, Africa lost its dearest scholar, its intellectually prodigious son, and African optimist, as part of his bequeathed legacy to future generations, leaving it to the future generation to build Africa into an economic, scientific, technologically, culturally diverse continent and African civilization. The African continent was inclusively his home, with its rich mosaic racial and cultural diversity. Mazrui stood firmly and advocated his principled position throughout his lifetime of a prosperous, developing and successful African continent. His African optimism was for him part of his African way of life and African civilization.
Nasikia moyo wangu kuna furaha, nikikuona pembeni yangu nasikia moyo wangu na furaha, ukienda mali nami nasikia nimekulia, hata ukiniacha saa moja ni kama mwaka mzima shidani, ukiniacha pamoja ni kama mwaka mzima shidani, usiniache nakutamani, ukiwa karibu yangu sikia moyo una furaha, elekeze mama, hata waniseme mimi usiku mchana wakala, nikiwa na wewe sijali mimi maneno yao, mapenzi ni kama kidonda kinauma, ukiwa mbali nami nasikia moyo wangu naumia, ukiwa karibu yangu nasikia na furaha, ukiwa pembeni yangu moyo wangu napata faraja, faraja yangu ni wewe, usiende mbali nami nakuhitaji, naumia, roho yangu naumia, nikikukosa pembeni yangu nachanganyikiwa, hata barabara natembea mimi nachanganyikiwa, wakiniuliza barabara ni mimi nakosa jibu ya kuwapea. Kila dakika nafikiria kama sikuone karibu yangu, roho yangu imejaa penzi lako bila mipaka, penzi lako limekaa ndani ya roho yangu kama nanga la jiwe baharini, wewe ni mali ya roho yangu kuliko dhahabu, wewe ni mali ya roho yangu kuliko vyote duniani, nakupenda sana, nakubembeleza, nikikuona kwa mbali umependeza kama malaika, nikikuona ni kama malaika, nikikutazama ni kama malaika yangu, naumia, nasikia moyo wangu kuna furaha, nikikuona pembeni yangu nasikia moyo wangu na furaha, ukienda mali nami nasikia nimekulia, hata ukiniacha saa moja ni kama mwaka mzima shidani, ukiniacha pamoja ni kama mwaka mzima shidani, usiniache nakutamani, ukiwa karibu yangu sikia moyo una furaha, elekeze mama, hata waniseme mimi usiku mchana wakala, nikiwa na wewe sijali mimi maneno yao, mapenzi ni kama